This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast. This week's guest is Clare Keller, a fashion designer and stylist who's previously worked at Ralph Lauren, Gucci, Pringle, Chloe and Givenchy. Clare is currently a trustee and spokesperson for the British Iris Society, a society dedicated to promoting and preserving UK irises and providing resources to iris growers. Given Clare's background in fashion, and what with the iris being one of the most picturesque flowers in history, the connection between the two seems obvious. But gardening and irises weren't something Clare was always involved with.
No, I come from the fashion industry, and it's interesting because quite often you read about fashion designers and their passion for gardens and flowers, and there's certainly many, many designers in history who have used flowers also even for their emblems, such as Chanel using the camellia, and obviously Dior had a passion for roses. And so it's quite interlinked. And myself, I sort of came into gardening a bit later when I was just starting to build a garden myself. I came down to Cornwall about 7 years ago and had a garden that was a sort of fairly small size, I'd say a third of an acre, and there was a long Cornish wall. A Cornish wall is essentially a big stony banked fence, and there was a privet hedge growing in the top, which is kind of my boundary wall, and the entire length of the front of that was a huge bank of irises, all one type. I didn't know what they were. They were quite simple, but they did look like bearded irises. It was one that I'd not seen in any nurseries or when I'd looked online. And so I actually contacted the British Iris Society to find out what they were, thinking maybe they are historic irises because they seem to be something that's not familiar in commercial outlets that I could buy them from. And that's how I got in touch, and I actually really loved the kind of conversation, the sort of lovely banter that we had back and forth about what they could be. And I got sort of exchange from one email to another, meeting different members of the society, trying to find out what it was. And it turns out it is what we think is called Alcazar, which I believe is a historic iris from the 1920s. I don't know if it's been in the wall since then, but certainly the house that I bought had been here since the sort of early 60s. So whether someone from that time planted them, I'm not sure. But they have been here, well, probably at least 50 years, and I do absolutely nothing to them, and they come up every year in the wall, and I can't tell you even what they're growing in because the entire wall is completely overgrown. So it's quite astonishing, really. But they're quite fabulous, and so I really got interested in the society through talking to various different members, and it's been a really lovely journey of understanding more about what they do and also about the way they work and how they try to preserve irises and actually encourage people to join the society to keep the iris growing community going.
Yeah, what a lovely journey to have gone on. So in terms of species, how many different types are there? And I wondered if you could maybe describe some of the main types that people might grow in their gardens. Because as a gardener who loves irises, I still sometimes think, oh, hang on a minute, which type is that? Because not only are there quite a few of them, they're quite distinct from each other, aren't they?
They are, and I have to say, that's the interesting thing about being part of a society. And just want to put it out there up front, everyone in the society is fairly amateur. It's not an intimidating society where you feel like there's all these very professional breeders. There are a few within us, definitely, but we're pretty much all lovers and amateur gardeners and just have a passion for this particular genus. And it's quite extraordinary. There are about 300 species of iris, and then within that, if you can imagine this number, there's 60,000 cultivars. And so it is said within, actually, there's two gentlemen, Signe Lingard and Lars Hofner, who's a member from Denmark, who claim to be able to grow an iris outside every month of the year. And so you can literally have irises 12 months of the year growing in your garden, which is quite an extraordinary thing for a flower. And they really are divided into three different groups. So you have at the beginning of the year, the bulbs. So that's the Dutch iris, the reticulatas and the Junos. And they do like full sun, and they're smaller in size. So the reticulata obviously being the tiniest ones. They're probably about the height of your hand, so maybe about 6 inches. and incredible blue colours. And you've probably seen recently on Gardener's World, Monty Don's a big fan of them too. And they have these extraordinary sort of blues, all the way from deep, deep blues, indigos almost, to the palest, very light, delicate sky blues. And then the sort of very velvety purples. And there are some yellow ones in there as well, which are kind of the sort of true iris colours, if you look at the sort of main types that they have for the bulbs. And the Dutch are the next ones that come out right after daffodils. So as your daffodils go over, the Dutch iris come up, and they're very long and elegant. And I would say they're probably about 30 or 40 centimetres tall. And they really have this extremely delicate, very, very soft flag type shape, but so fine and very refined. And generally they are white, the sort of pale blues, going into the purples. And they've had recent introductions. I think it's called Lion King, which is a lovely Bordeaux bronzy colour. And then there's a yellow. And so those come up sort of right after the daffs, kind of as you go into sort of late April. And then they like the full sun, and they're a bulb. So they come in actually a tiny little bulb with a sort of papery outer layer. And they like to be planted deep. And as with all bulbs, and something well draining is really good, but they're super easy to grow. And I have to say, I've been fairly sort of neglectful of some of mine, even in pots, and they just flowered incredibly. Even if I haven't watered them every week, I might have gone 2 or 3 weeks and gone, oh no, I forgot to water. And I've come back, and they because they're so drought tolerant, they just keep going, and they've got incredible resources. And so they put on a fantastic show at the early part of the year. So really from sort of end January through to the end of April, you can really go with the bulbs, I would say, of the iris family. And then you have the other two main groups, which are the beardless and the bearded. And I think most people know the bearded as being those fabulously tall, kind of wonderful flag irises, with some that are very frilly, which are the more modern irises, and then the historic ones, which are much more simple, and the ones that you often find in paintings. And there's like a fantastic history to the iris, especially from the historic point of view. You're going all the way back to ancient times between the Egyptians and the Romans loving irises. Florence, the emblem of the city from that time in the Byzantine time, has got the beautiful fleur-de-lis, which is obviously a very heritage iris shape. And then you go even into Elizabethan times. There's a portrait of Elizabeth I, and she has a dress covered in irises. So it's just got a fantastic kind of heritage. And the historic ones are, I would say, categorized by the fact that they're quite simple in form, and they tend to be the stronger of the irises to grow. That's what's in my wall. And as I said, it's probably been there decades, and they are known to be extremely robust. And I think that's one of the characteristics. They were bred to be extremely upright and straight. And they generally, I think, have between sort of 5 to 6 or 7 flowers per stem. Whereas the more modern ones, you can get up to maybe even 12 flowers per stem. So much more proliferous, and they're still really stunning. And they can even grow as high as sort of 5 foot tall. They're quite fantastic flowers, depending on how happy they are in their spot. Whereas the beardless, I would say the category of beardless irises, they differ in the fact that they can be grown in full sun, but also some of them partly in shade. And I know that's an appealing factor to some people, because quite often you end up having those patches of your garden where you've got slightly shadier areas. And they seem to be okay. They seem to be a little bit happier in that sort of environment. So that's the Siberian irises, the Japanese irises, and then, of course, yellow flag irises, which are very happy in ponds and bogs and very watery environments. So there's sort of a full range of different typographies that you can grow irises in. It's really about that classic saying of right plant for a right place.
Wow. I mean, that is such a good overview. Thank you for that. So in thinking about things that are maybe slightly different in the world of irises, are there any that people might buy? You know, I've done it myself. I've gone to a flower show, I've bought an iris, and I've not had a lot of success getting it to come back. But that's because I've gone for something ridiculously fancy. I've stuck it in my clay and I'm heading for a cropper. It's always going to happen. But I can't help myself because I'm just enthralled by them and I can't leave it behind. But thinking about other irises, are there any that aren't completely hardy, or are they all fine in our climate in the UK?
I would say most of them are, I have to say, unless you've got a particularly sort of wet and cold and freezing spot of the UK, you might suffer from a bit of root rot. But the main body of irises can cope with pretty much anything. I mean, I'm lucky down here in Cornwall, we don't have particularly cold winters. It's fairly mild and we're baking hot in the summer. So my soil can sometimes go to concrete almost, but they love it. That's when they flower, is when the soil is its most toughest. And like I said, the historic ones are in a wall, and I can genuinely say I have no idea what they're growing in, because that wall has probably got hardly any soil in. So all I can think of, and I can see the rhizomes sort of between clumps of ivy on the wall, and they're just extraordinary. They come up every year without fail. So there are sometimes those things where you hear those stories of, you get a plant that is growing in some gravel or something like that, and you think, right, I'll just put it in some soil, and then it dies on you. And you think, but it was growing in nothing before, I don't understand. And you do find that there are these different types of irises that can grow in really harsh, extreme conditions. But I would say if you are in a particularly cold and wet environment, then I would probably go for the more wet types of irises that seem to be happier in that type of environment. So the yellow flag iris, which is the pond one, and grows along the edge of kind of wet, boggy areas. And apparently it's a real thug. I don't have any, but I know people who do, and they literally say, God, the thing is just like a weed. It goes everywhere. And so that one seems to be particularly prolific. And I do believe the Louisiana irises as well, which grow in Louisiana, sort of in the southern states, and they particularly are kind of keen to be in a sort of slightly more boggy and wet environment, so they can cope with a little bit of that. But again, if you've got kind of heavy clay, chalky soil, there are irises that do work quite well in that. So generally they like a free draining environment, but that's really about just changing your soil structure so that you can get it just right for them.
And if you do live somewhere where it's maybe not ideal for the irises, can you grow them in containers? I know you mentioned you've got some in pots.
Yeah, definitely. The bulbs are fantastic in pots, definitely, just as most bulbs do really well in pot or in the ground. And I find actually they flower better in a pot than in the ground. I find when they're in the ground, sometimes they don't quite get the sort of, I guess, the concentration. When they're in the soil, they sort of seem to get a lot more green leaves than I get as a stronger flower. Whereas I find that, especially the first year I plant them, I get a fantastic display in a pot. But you also get to pop them sort of on your windowsill or in the house for the week or two that they're flowering, and get to enjoy them up close, which I really, really love. But I've actually potted irises on, and of course you can, and this is going a little bit more into propagation, but you can grow irises from seed. So that's generally how they start out their first 2 or 3 years, is in a pot. And they do quite well. And it's a good way to get the root system going really deep and long, so that when they actually do go in the ground, they've got some good legs to anchor themselves on.
Oh, that's interesting. So you would propagate them from seed, so presumably taking cuttings off the root.
Yeah, exactly. The rhizome variety, which is the bearded, that you can easily propagate from the extra roots that they put off. So that's the sort of almost tuberous, almost sort of like a Jerusalem artichoke looking type root. And generally you'll find that they do the offshoots from the original mother, and then you eventually, after 2 or 3 years, break off those extra children, as it were. And then the mother plant at the beginning dies off. And so you end up getting that sort of goes grey and sort of shrivels up. Honestly, in my wall, I have not chopped anything up, and it sort of just shrivels away over the years. But for a better health of plant, it's good to sort of cut it out and then let the new ones start developing, and they provide strong new plants. But the society really promotes seeds, actually, and most of the members try to collect seeds from their gardens, and we sell them on the website, and you can get 10 packs of seeds for £5. And that way you get to grow an iris that maybe potentially you might pot on and then give to other people. But it's a quick turnaround. So the seed grows obviously the first year, and then you pop it in, as most people do in the spring, in a nice pot, in a good sort of free draining compost. And then about a year later, you should get a good growth of the green leaves. And within the second or third year, you'll get your flower. So it's quite a quick process, which is quite encouraging. But often with the seed process of propagating, you find that it might be a long time before you get the flower. But actually, with irises, it's fairly fast.
That is good to know, actually. I didn't realise that. I don't need to know that because now I'm going to be on your website.
And we do. We have a big list on the website, so you can go on and look them up, and it's all the different types of irises. So you can find the one that particularly suits your soil, and then they have both historic and modern irises. So it's a good mix. The thing we don't have on the site are the bulbs, because you can get those quite freely at nurseries. But generally, most of the members do contribute to the seeds and the bank that goes into the society. And that's part of what we do, is really try to promote people to grow them on their own and potentially then cross-pollinate and maybe make a new one. And so that's part of some of the services that happen within the society, of trying to really encourage lots of animators to get involved. And it's a really lovely community, trying to build up the stocks and to maintain some of the historic ones too.
That's really interesting. And what other work is underway to conserve some of the historic ones?
The historic ones come from way, way back. And I think obviously people might be quite familiar with the Dykes Medal. And William Dyke was around sort of in the late 1800s. And he was really an amateur botanist. And that's how most people start, as amateurs, really interested in the genus. And so he met Sir Michael Foster at Oxford University and started his passion for studying irises. And Dykes was the one who really did the most, I think, at the very beginning, before the society was created, in really understanding the iris in terms of not only its origins, but also how to cultivate it and breed it. And so he was doing a lot of work scientifically in a very amateur way, but trying to understand how the genus has evolved over time. And so he wrote quite important books in the early teens of the last century. And from that, to actually encourage somebody he met along the way, a man called Arthur Bliss, who actually is a distant relative of one of the members of our society. And Arthur Bliss was one of the members who actually set up both the American and the British Society of Irises. And he really started to create an amazing amount of cultivation of irises. And actually the one that he is most famous for is Dominion. And Dominion is the iris that is, if you like, the mother plant of many, many of the cultivars we see today. Quite an incredible flower, which was hailed at the time as one of the most extraordinary irises, because it has the most sort of lush, silky velvet form. And that was something that was hugely prized. And actually, his love of irises really grew from trying to breed the one thing that no one's managed to do yet, which is the pure red iris. We have absolutely every colour under the sun. Iris is the name of rainbow. And it's true, the iris family has got literally everything from the most pure crystal white to black, literally jet black. The iris root, actually, in historic times, if you mixed it, I think I would say it's with sulfur dioxide or a certain chemical, the root produces a black ink that can actually be used for printing, just jet black. So it's got this incredible breadth of colour, but the one colour that's missing is that sort of almost like the classic red, like a red rose. That is the only colour that doesn't really truly exist in irises. And that was his passion, was to try and create a true red crimson iris. And in trying to cross and cultivate this, he came across Dominion, which is literally the mother plant of so many of the modern irises. And so the Dykes Medal was created as part of all of this breeding and cultivation over the time. And so one of our members has a collection of Arthur Bliss's irises, which there are many, many, about nearly close to 100. And then from that, another collector was given access to his notes and information and breeding, a chap called John Taylor. And there's, again, a member who sort of take care. So there's a lot of caretaking of ancestors who've worked with irises, which is really lovely. So that's been a big part of creating the historic society.
That's fascinating about the red. Does that ever occur in the nectar guides?
No, it's generally those sort of hot oranges. So the lovely kind of fluffy beard that you see, which is so characteristic of the tall bearded, can be any colour. And that's what's quite interesting. If you just take one colour, let's say the most extreme, the blacks, which are these incredible, like darkest purples. And there's one that is literally like a true black. And you can sometimes get the flash of a yellow or a flash of an orange. And there are breeders who breed these different flashes on the beards, which is kind of fabulous. So that they've got these wonderful kind of hints of different colours within. But the beards are really there to help guide the bees, and the bees go in and they just get covered because it's just this big fluffy sort of hairbrush almost as you go into the flower. You can see them sort of wandering around in there, completely getting covered in the nectar. And obviously the tall bearded, they flower in succession. So the bees come back week after week, and the flowers, they sort of open up from the base of the stem and then slowly go up to the top. And they obviously give a really nice life of 2 to 3 weeks for the bees to come in and pollinate. And depending on what iris you have growing around, obviously you will be cross-pollinating with the bees. And that's what a lot of society members do. They might have accidental crosses from the bees wandering around. But then, of course, you can do it by hand if you want specific different mixes together. But probably the most floriferous are the Siberians because they have a lot of flowers. It's a big bushier plant. And so it's got a finer reed-like sort of leaf, which looks really attractive even when the flowers aren't there. But the actual plant itself is quite floriferous. So you'll get a lot of bees going around that because there's a lot of flowers all at once. So, the beards are a lovely feature, I think, of the irises.
Yeah, I know we can explain why the patterning is on an iris flower. But actually, it's so exotic, it kind of almost sits outside nature. They're almost kind of, I don't want to say, it might sound a bit fluffy, but they're almost kind of divine. Do you think that's why people are so attracted to them universally?
They are. I think it's the fact that there is this exoticness to them, but actually they are something that's much more common in sort of Europe, the Mediterranean, and America, actually. I mean, they grow everywhere from mountains to bogs to deserty arid areas. There's so many different sort of terrains that they can occur in. And of course the Japanese really admired irises and not only used them in their paintings but also on kimonos and in their art. And so there's this elegance that they have and this almost orchid-like look. And just in terms of the artistic value, I guess, of an iris, you can have everything from an extremely simple, refined iris to a really blousy, frilly, quite sort of girly, feminine one in a way. And like I said, the variety of colours is kind of extraordinary. So if you've got a real passion for browns, there are brown irises. You know, there's these beautiful kind of beigey pinks and lovely sort of bronze colours. And actually I've recently got into sort of that family of colours because it's a really unusual colour to have in the garden. And normally you think of browns as being a sort of decaying tone and a colour of sort of withering, but actually these are sort of tinged with pink and rose and red. So there isn't really another flower I can think of that has that other than orchids. And so there's this really lovely thing of having these very tall, almost orchid-like plants, whereas most of the time you think of orchids as an indoor plant that you have in your house or something that's so exotic that you have to have this very specific growing environment. And I think that's the lovely thing about irises. It kind of gives you that exotic flavour. So if you kind of like having a bit of an exotic, spiky garden, an iris fits perfectly within that because the foliage is that strong, sort of sword-like shape. But then you get this beautiful, sort of really gorgeous, lovely floriferous flower that just pops up for a month. There's a lot of development now, especially in America, actually, with Schreiner, who's a big nursery in America that is really doing a lot of work on reflowering irises. So ones that flower in May, and then they'll come back at the end of the summer and flower again in sort of late August, September, which is kind of rather lovely to think that you could have a second flush of something beautiful then, especially the blues, which are very uncommon to get blue flowers at the end of the summer. So that's a really nice feature too that's starting to get developed quite strongly.
Funnily enough, it was one of the brown ones that I did pull in the garden. I think the whole range of colours. I bought about 3 of them that year as well. So yeah, they are. They're this world. You know, you don't.
Yeah, so beautiful. Yeah.
So if, like me, you'd like to go see some irises and become tempted by their beauty, where's the best place for people to see them in person?
Well, I think obviously the main places you would go, any of the RHS gardens, they usually have a good variety of irises. Risley has got some of the Japanese and the Sibs. They've also got the water irises, but also Kew Gardens. And actually, the main gardens there have got a lot of the tall bearded and the Germanicas. So there's a lot of variety that you can see through the seasons, through those societies. Risley actually does the early ones too, the reticulatas. Also, the big shows. So this springtime, so on the 7th and the 8th of May, so that weekend, the British Irish Society will be at Risley, so you can see much of what we do and also some of the members' irises on display. The Chelsea Flower Show this year, because the Society is 100 years this year, so we have a centenary stand at Chelsea Flower Show. That's the 24th and 28th of May, so various members of the Society will be there all that week, and you can come and talk to us, and we'll be selling seed. And we will have some plants on display as well that you can get. And then at the end of September, we're having a big anniversary weekend near Stratford-on-Avon. That's the 17th and the 18th of September. And that's where the Society gets together, and actually there's lots of talks from Society members and breeders of iris on the various different types and also how to grow irises in the best way. So lots of opportunities. And then, of course, the nurseries that do sell irises, such as Seagate up in Lincolnshire, there's Clare Austin, Wootton's, Chailey Irises in Kent, and Irises of Sissinghurst, which is not part of Sissinghurst Castle, but they have a heritage collection of irises as well.
Thank you very much to Clare for being such an informed and passionate champion of irises. I'll be popping down to the British Iris Society stand at Chelsea next week, and we'll try very hard to leave without ordering any, but I doubt that will happen. Thankfully, I won't be there on the sell-off day, which is the most dangerous time to be at any of the RHS shows if you're a plant glutton like me. Thanks to you for listening. Here's Dr. Ian Bedford talking about organic recyclers.
A healthy, naturally balanced ecosystem, where plant life and animals live in harmony, is dependent on a complex web of interactions that function between them. Often fragile interactions that govern the survival of individual species and the habitats where they feed and reproduce. And we'll certainly witness some of these interactions in our gardens, such as those between the flowering plants and their pollinators, the herbivores that feed on the plants, and the creatures that predate on them. But probably less obvious are the interactions on the ground and within the garden soil, with the creatures that consume dead organic matter, converting it into the natural compost that sustains nutrient-rich, healthy soils. The recyclers, creatures that include the earthworms, numerous fly larvae, and beetle grubs. However, some of the most effective recyclers are often wrongly assumed to be plant pests, such as the many slug species that only eat rotting vegetation, and the woodlice that consume decaying wood. Also, a unique group of invertebrates that were one of the first animals to appear on land over 400 million years ago, and have remained an important element of healthy ecosystems. Millipedes, nocturnal, detritus-eating creatures with long, segmented bodies that are sometimes mistakenly referred to as pests when found feeding amongst plants that had already been damaged by other creatures. Despite similarities to centipedes, their carnivorous cousins, millipedes differ by having 2 pairs of legs per body segment, while centipedes have 1. They also differ by being able to coil their bodies into a tight spiral when disturbed, which protects their head and their many pairs of legs. Extraordinarily large numbers of legs, which obviously inspired their millipede name, meaning 1,000 feet. But following on from their classification in the 18th century, millipedes hadn't actually lived up to their name, and in fact, people who'd spent their time counting legs on the different species contemptuously called them frauds, since the highest number of legs ever recorded was 750 on a Californian millipede in 1920. However, 101 years later, during 2021, 60 metres below scrubland in Western Australia, a previously unrecorded species of millipede was discovered. A species that justifiably was a genuine millipede, with a truly astonishing leg tally of 1,306.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.